Yes, you're very welcome along to the polling station. And if there are two individuals that are more likely to be talked about on the show, we haven't found them yet. It's Boris Johnson and Donald Trump this week. One reckons he's going to get arrested. The other one is Donald Trump. Okay, I'm slightly exaggerating. Boris Johnson is he's in a bit of heat as well. William Kedjanyi is going to go through what may happen to Boris Johnson. This could actually end up in a by-election if it goes to one extreme. On the other extreme, nothing may happen at all. And obviously, what are the repercussions for Donald Trump, who, as of the recording now, and we are 2:08 on what day is today? What day is today?
Thursday, the 23rd of March.
Thursday, he hasn't been arrested yet. We are also joined by Paul Krishnamurty, who is in the beautiful part of the world that we call Rhodes. How are you, William?
I am good. I am very busy. I feel like I want to thank everybody in the Institute for Government for making sure my head doesn't explode, looking at the various possible outcomes of what might happen to Boris Johnson, as well as just a general question of what is a privileges committee. So we'll look through that because yesterday was really significant on a number of fronts. Some things happened also away from the major headlines that are worth looking at.
Yeah, and Paul, we haven't even discussed what's going on with the protocol in the north as well. The vote has gone through in favour of Rishi Sunak, another boost actually to his premiership. And I see the Conservatives are into 7-2 for the next election.
I think, look, as I was saying last time, I think that Sunak's played an absolute blind protocol. It's a victory for kind of serious politics over the madness of the Johnson era. But as it stands, it's never going to be enough for the DUP, is it? They are never going to be. They will always find a reason to object to restoring Stormont. But nonetheless, it is very good from a British-Irish relations, from a British-European relations, and generally Britain not looking like a serious country again. Right, so that's all positive. Whether that has any electoral impact, I don't know. Amid all the noise of nonsense that is going on, like yesterday, I wonder how much of that has cut through.
Yeah, I think day-to-day British people probably have more things to worry about than that. But I agree with you. I think Rishi Sunak has pulled off a bit of a blinder there, and he's done it relatively in a relatively kind of I guess chilled out manner. There wasn't much fanfare about it. It did take time, but Rishi Sunak has I think he's gone up my estimation, and no over majority in the next election, 15-8. I think looks tempting. William, Boris Johnson, though, this is where we start this week.
Yeah, we do start with Boris Johnson and the big showdown. Finally, he gives evidence on what supposedly happened with, I will call it Partygate, and all of those parties last year. On the screen right about now, by the way, is a list of all those transgressions. I'll be amazed if it fits, because today actually is the 3-day anniversary of the first official UK lockdown. So, look at what's happened in all that time. So long story short, yesterday, Boris Johnson was in front of the Privileges Committee. They're investigating, and this is very important here, whether he deliberately or recklessly misled the House. In pure and simple English, did he intend to lie to Parliament, and can that be proven?
Which is difficult for somebody who probably doesn't really know one from the other at this stage.
Yeah, it's a tricky standard because of the proof of intent. And this is why we've had a really deep inquiry, not a legal inquiry, but a very far-reaching inquiry, which has unearthed lots of messages, photos, emails from the time. Now, what you might think, does this have to do with political betting, whatever? And actually, it is fairly important, I would argue, because it's possible that in, I'd say, less than 2 years, the Conservative Party will be looking for another leader. And Boris Johnson, I think probably because of his name and his stature, is still taking a fair amount of money, both on fixed books and the exchanges, in terms of market position, for his chances to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, for his chances of some sort of comeback. I and Paul, I think, have been fairly against the chances of him making a comeback. I think yesterday really solidifies that. It might be sort of a death knell for it. But also, in a wider sense, this does have effects for Rishi Sunak too, namely because the Conservatives' best chance, I think, of getting a positive result next general election is detachment from Johnson, from anything to do with his public image, and an attachment to Sunak and any positive ratings he has, along with improvements. So I've spoken for quite a long time there, but basically yesterday was really important because I think it probably puts the seal on containing Johnson for Sunak, etc. That in turn, I think, improves the Tory chances at the next election.
How do you call it?
I still have Labour winning majority for a few reasons. We'll talk about Scotland, by the way. You haven't even mentioned Scotland yet, but what's happening to the SNP is coming at a godsend time for Keir Starmer. I think the key things that are going to decide the next election will be probably the economy, the NHS, our public services, and also potentially, given its salience now, immigration, which is a choice the Tories have chose to make. Sunak will need to win three of those things, three of those big battles, I think, to really turn the tide. He can definitely get closer, and the bar's really high for Starmer, but the direction of travel is still very much against him. And only recently have we seen some bits of improvement in the polling, and even then, the general direction of travel is still Labour lead, solidly high teens. A lot would need to happen, I think, for that to come down, particularly.
Okay, there are parallels, Paul, with Donald Trump here, and I think you'll be of the same mindset that it's just the odds are stacked against him. Donald Trump is obviously, he's third favourite to be the next president, but he may well end up actually being incarcerated in the meantime. But in terms of Boris Johnson, how is this man 5-1 to be the next Conservative leader?
Well, I guess it is because were Sunak to be destabilised in the months ahead, and that, we don't know how bad the local elections will be yet. We'll discuss that at the time, but they don't look good. And Sunak will destabilise. I'm quite certain that as long as he's still an MP, Boris Johnson throws his hat into the ring. And if he makes the top two, he wins amongst the members. I don't think he would make the top two amongst them. I think the MPs would stop that. But he is still in the running. There are a lot of other people in that market who will never run and who highly unlikely to ever see having a chance. So he is it. I wouldn't bet on him. I personally think that he's finished. And yesterday to me was just a complete circus. It was everything that turns people off politics. It's just ridiculous. There's so many more serious things going on in the world, right? And the idea that all of this time is being devoted to saying, did a man who we all know lied mean to lie? It's ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous, right? Now, I think that I wouldn't place big money on this, but I think there's a very good chance that he will be suspended for 10 days and we will see that by-election. Simply because I think that there are enough Tory MPs, and certainly people around Rishi Sunak, who think that they have to make this clean break. They have to demonstrate. It would help the party to demonstrate that 3 years of utter madness, populism, etc., is gone, and we're back to being, and we're about rebuilding the old Conservative brand of competence and seriousness. And so, and also, I mean, if he does stay in Parliament, if he's not buried by this, he's going to come back to haunt Sunak. We see this with his complete opportunism over the Northern Ireland Protocol. He's not a serious person, Boris Johnson, and he will just do anything he can to get back to number 10.
Yeah, and I think Paul touched on a good point there, William, in that like you have the polar opposite really of what like Sunak probably looks at not Boris Johnson in the mirror. He looks at Boris Johnson and says, I want to be exactly what he isn't. I want to be serious. I want to restore the Conservative brand. And you imagine that Conservative Party will align with that over time.
Yeah, and I think the big winner from yesterday was Rishi Sunak. By a country mile, was the biggest winner of yesterday. Firstly, Johnson, listen, he can argue whatever about the technical finer details of his case. He can get the best briefing in the land, which he's getting because he's got Lord Panic. But at the end of the day, it's the evidence that does for him. The only defence he's now left with, basically, is we had to have leaving parties for staff morale. And even if that is enough to get him out of being charged or sanctioned, my personal opinion is that it won't. That's just not going to wash with people who had to go through so much anyway. So optically, done. The rebellion was small. It had big names in it, but it was very small. It was 29 or so. It was nothing, right? The majority of 486 was huge. The ERG might argue about the amendment, the abstentions, etc. But when it comes down to it, it doesn't matter. It's going through, for all intensive purposes, it's done. That's victory number 2. Victory number 3, and this is not me making some sort of personal slight on Sunak. It's just, it was smart timing, even if a bit cynical, to put his tax summary. It wasn't an actual tax return, but he put his tax summaries out yesterday, and he's neutralized, I think, quite a lot of Rishi Sunak rich person discourse by doing that. That was pretty smart thinking. I think he's had a very good day where all of the negative attention will be soaked up by Boris Johnson, and he can basically have a bit of breathing space.
It is actually hilarious just looking at the headlines here, Paul. Watch, hand on heart, I did not lie, Johnson grilled. Boris Johnson questioned about leaving due photo. We avoided physical contact but passed drinks, Johnson. Johnson asked if wine bottles necessary for work event. Johnson's questionable comments on Partygate scandal.
It's ludicrous. And I mean, how this is anything other than bad news for the Tory party to be talking about this, nearly a year after he left office. It's insane, like I was saying, that Sunak has got an improving narrative to talk about.
Isn't that the thing, though? In one sense, it's kind of good for the Conservatives because it shines a light on what they were but aren't anymore notionally.
I think it's just bad on that front because you're reminding people who voted for them at the last election, who were voting for them in opinion polls 2 years ago, why they have abandoned them in such large numbers. It's just terrible. Whereas we should be, if you are a Conservative spin doctor, you want to be talking about the Northern Ireland Protocol. You want to talk about slightly better than expected economic forecasts. You want to be talking about the policies that you're doing. Whatever we think about it, they want to talk about small votes because they think that wins them votes. And instead, we are talking about this ridiculous episode with Partygate. So I don't think it's good for them at all, and I think they have to get rid of him. On the betting, though, I agree with you. I think no overall majority is the bet. I think that, I think it's going to be very hard for Labour to not get 42% plus. That's very, very hard to see. But it won't be well distributed. It will not be efficiently distributed. It will be in cities and university towns. And I see these areas on the target lists like Somerset and Hampshire and Surrey. I'm just not convinced. They've never voted Labour before. Why would they now?
Yeah, and I genuinely don't actually really know what Labour stands for. Is it properly left wing? It's trying to remove itself from Corbynism. What does it stand for that isn't the Conservatives? On the positive for Labour, William, though, we have this situation in Scotland, which isn't really shining favour for the SNP. Hamza Yousaf's now gone into 2-11 as well to be the next Prime Minister. We are closing in on that.
Yeah, just on the what Labour stands for point, I think the whole thing with Labour was present yourself as an alternative that removes stress from people's lives. Something that the party that if you vote for us, you don't have to think about politics every day. You don't have to see all these ridiculous headlines. It doesn't have to be essentially just become a wrestling style sport, right? That's I think the whole vibe they're leaning into. With regards to the SNP, firstly, I don't know what happened to make Hamza Yousaf 11-2 on. I'm struggling to think about the big event that led to such a drop in the odds. Across Cheltenham week or whatever, at the end of Cheltenham week, he was 9-2 on. There have been a couple of debates. They've been testy. They've been sort of really full on. I know that he had that personal gaffe, and I know that Kate Forbes' religious belief was brought up again. But aside from that, I don't know what exactly has happened. I haven't seen any sort of massively conclusive polling. I haven't seen any huge scandal, any big blow landed to make him 11-2 on now. So, I mean, he might well win. I still have him as a favourite, but I don't know what's going on there. I think the bigger picture here, basically, is, as Paul referenced, I think 2 weeks ago, the cratering of a coalition that had been one of the most electorally impressive in the UK. That's going to lead to some really big gaps. The biggest winner from those gaps is probably Labour, I think.
Yeah, and like on the Scottish independence thing, Paul. If you are like a staunch backer of it, you are getting a bit jittery here because you're like, is this whole thing kind of crumbling at the seams?
I think it is probably the same. I think that um, I think Youssef. I completely agree with Will. I don't think he really looks like a 2 to 11 chance, Hunter Youssef, but I do think he'll win probably by 53-47, 55-45, something like that. Um, but I think that in addition to their own problems, the SNP, as in Nicola Sturgeon not being there, who was probably the only person capable of marshalling that coalition, we're just in a different world now. I vividly remember 2015-16 and their surge after the independence referendum. And it was same time that UKIP thrived in the UK and Labour started their descent into absolute disaster. And it was because of nationalism.
Yeah,
Nationalism, just identity, just dominated the conversation. We're not in that place anymore. We are in a new era now, and living standards are the thing, right? Now, the SNP are, whatever you think of their policies on that stuff, they've been in government for as long as anyone can remember now in Scotland. So they have to take some responsibility for that. And you have that on top of a massive culture war division, the top of the party. And I think they'll go back to where they were before the independence referendum.
yeah, fascinating times ahead. We're going to move on to the US now. So effectively, Donald Trump was, I don't know, calling for his own arrest or calling for the likelihood of his own arrest earlier this week. William, this is by any standards an extraordinary week in US politics, and the man is still a third favorite to be the next president.
Yeah. If I had a pound or even a penny or a cent for every single time I've said Donald Trump has done this and then repeated something that no politicians had ever done before, I'd be an extremely rich man, probably just about rich enough not to do the polling station anymore. But anyhow, so long story short here, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social a week or so back that he was going to be arrested. He talked all the usual Donald Trump talk about how there was a crooked investigation against him, and it's all a huge conspiracy. Then he asked for, I think, people to protest when he was arrested next Tuesday. Now, the date has come and passed, and as of yet, he is still a free man. But I believe a grand jury may be meeting to decide how to move close to an indictment. Long story short, something is obviously very close. As to whether he'll be arrested, I wouldn't have any certainty about that, but it really looks as if we're getting close to indictments. That's what all the talk is suggesting. Certainly that's what people on the MAGA side are saying. Interesting thing to note, however, we aren't getting a lot of leaks from government or the DA's office about this. All of the rumors being put out by Trump himself and his supporters. And there's been a lot of fundraising off the back of this. I think 1.5 billion in the last 2 and a bit days alone. I wouldn't discount the idea of this being hyped up to drive donations. I mean, I can see Paul on the internet screen ready to launch him. But as we're all familiar with, the Trumps are very good at manufacturing a situation to increase their cash balance. So that wouldn't surprise me either.
Paul, yes, yes, yes.
Yes, I mean, that's why he's doing it. When he said he was going to be arrested as well, there was nothing to that. His attorney denied it within an hour. So, I mean, this is just like Donald's been reading some newspaper reports and drawn that conclusion. I think
he was hungover, but he doesn't drink, so it's like, yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely, straight as anything, Donald. But I think he is going to be charged by Manhattan, also by Georgia, and I think that Jack Smith's prosecutions into the documents thing is heating up. I also think, without a shadow of a doubt, he uses that as a fundraising mechanism. What's also interesting, though, is that it's pretty clear from his own behaviour in recent days that Ron DeSantis is running, right? And it is also clear that Trump, that they're now, the war of words has begun. And there was a very long Truth Social post last night aimed at Ron DeSantis. I'm not convinced Trump wrote it himself because it was actually quite a competent attack. It wasn't completely insane. But I just wonder, is DeSantis going to survive this? I mean, I have been of the view throughout that when it comes to, if it boils down to them two, DeSantis wins, right? And I do think the Trump thing is over. I mean, I noticed, who's going to turn up on these protests? Apparently, there was a protest planned for Monday. No one showed up in
Yeah.
New York, right? And we saw this after the midterms. So I do wonder if it's dead. But at the same time, it was pretty cutting, that assault on Truth Social last night on DeSantis. And he does find himself, Ron DeSantis, in a funny position now where he's trying to ride both horses. Like, I notice he's trying to walk back some of his comments on Ukraine now, because clearly.
Well, just on that, like, so Taylor Greene last week basically gives an interview where she literally shows that she has no idea what continent Ukraine is. And like, if you look at DeSantis' comments, like calling it a territorial dispute, you're like, do you know anything about what's going on in the world?
No, they don't. I mean, very clearly, the MAGA wing of the Republican Party are not into foreign policy. They just believe whatever rubbish he comes out with Trump. That's where we're in this position. But the point here is that Trump's people and Green and Boebert and these people, they are all going to back Russia to the hill under any circumstances. The money's pouring in from that lobby, and they're not going to drop that. The mainstream Republican Party does not take that view, right? They've supported Biden on arming Ukraine. And, if we go back to the start of this, they were more hawkish on this subject than the Democrats were. Now, DeSantis clearly has gone on Tucker Carlson and made these comments because he thinks, oh, well, I need to appease that base. But he's going to get pushback for that. And I noticed now Nikki Haley yesterday really reinforcing her anti-Russia credentials, because the alternatives are going to say, well, hang on a minute, right? If you lot are going to take that stance, there's a pool of donors out there who will defend Ukraine, right? And maybe there's a place in the race. So maybe that ends up, there's a scenario here where DeSantis blows himself out, right? Or Trump destroys him very quickly. And then we're into this weird position in the summer or the end where Trump has kind of 47, 48%, really solid. The other side are going to have to do something. They're going to have to push someone up. And maybe that person isn't DeSantis. I'm inclined to think it is still, but maybe there is still scope for someone else.
Would you agree with that, William?
Yeah, I would. I don't think. I think there's a long, long way to run on this. Particularly also, let's not get distracted just by what may be happening in New York. Trump has plenty of other legal troubles, and the thing about American election cycles is they're the longest and shortest things in the world, because so much happens over so much time, but the immediacy is able to grip the market and move it in 1,000 different directions. Trump's facing charges in Georgia. He's got the Mar-a-Lago probe from the Justice Department. He's also got the January 6th committee, whatever. Whether charges may materialize remains an unknown, but I'd suggest that the Georgia probe will be very, very difficult because there's a lot of evidence there that we've seen in plain sight. So that would be something I think to consider with regards to the future of the betting on this. Regarding DeSantis, I think his difficulty might be that he can't stay in the middle of the highway, to turn a phrase. He's going to have to shift relatively, by the way, left or right, I think, at some stage. And I think that means probably losing a bit of his support, probably taking a bit of pushback on previous positions. Regarding his foreign policy, it's actually sort of really well known. There's a lot of foreign policy writings and experiences he has out there. So I'd expect that down the line, that will play a bigger part in the campaign. I do think there is scope for somebody to pop up, particularly also if DeSantis just does decide in 4 years or whatever is better for me. That's still an option for him. I don't think he's got forever to wait around and decide, but I definitely think he can go again in 4 years and drop out and be a very popular governor of Florida and then say goodbye and switch. I think that's an option open to him that isn't to other candidates in the race.
You've been strong on Biden, Paul, from the get-go to run in 2024 and also to get elected, and he obviously endeared himself to Irish Americans last week with St. Patrick's Day and all of that, and he just seems to be taking along very nicely.
I think he's a great price. I'm not like mega confident that he would win, say if he were to be against DeSantis, but the price is wrong because he's clearly going to run. Clearly, like everything is in place. They're building a campaign team. You know, it's public knowledge, right? And when he announces, surely that shortens from 9 to 4 to 6 to 4 at least, right? I think if he comes up against Trump, he will win. And even if I'm sceptical Trump will be the nominee, the betting makes him hot favourite. So Biden should be shorter. Just on the indictments as well, I just want to say as well, the irony here is that the Stormy Daniels one is by far the weakest. That is a weak indictment. That does look like a political hatchet job, right? Because who doesn't know that story already? Who hasn't already formed
Stormy in a teacup, you might say.
It is, yeah. And I mean, given that
I'm laughing at my own joke there.
But given everything that Manhattan and New York in general have been investigating, it would be ludicrous if that's the only indictment they come up with against Trump. But the Georgia thing, as Will says, that looks a real open and shut case, and it's devastating, right? And we don't know half of it yet. Like some of the grand jury have spoken to press and stuff and said this is really dynamite stuff. And I think that the way to look at it is think in terms of stages now. The debates start in August, Milwaukee, first one. Trump is going to be asked from day one, number one, will you run as an independent, right? And he's not going to get away with that like he did in 2016, right? And number two, will you accept the result? Number three, will you condemn far-right violent protests, right? People who have been convicted or have pleaded guilty over January 6th. And I don't think that any Republicans who are backing Trump and have thought this through. This will be the most disastrous election campaign in history. How can you have a campaign where one of the candidates refuses to accept the result beforehand? And everyone knows the last time he did it resulted in an insurrection.
Yeah, and the bad thing is, William, if he actually kind of toned down on this nonsense, it would probably hurt his vote.
Yeah, I mean, talk about being between a rock and a hard place. That's Trump's core base. Trump's core base is full of believers to the maximum degree that the last election was stolen, and that everything that happens against him is an establishment globalist stitch-up or whatever. And he can't pivot from that. So he basically has to tread down that path. I think to keep his base happy and intact. I won't underestimate it one bit. It's still a very powerful base with a huge reach that goes beyond mainstream media because of the way I think American political life is conducted nowadays. But in terms of running a campaign with proper scrutiny, because at the moment he's not really facing that. He's just posting on Truth Social about how he's going to be arrested soon and about how Ron DeSantis is, weak and short and looks bad in proper suits and stuff. But you can't really do that once you get to the point where you get debated. Even the most right-word commentator, whatever, will eventually push him on the questions Paul asked, and by then he's got to have an answer. I think that can hold, and I'm not sure if he will by that point.
Okay, that was the polling station this week. If you check out the Star Sports website, I would argue, maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I do think Star Sports leads the way with political betting, all thanks to William Kedjanyi. There's betting on next Scottish First Minister, next party leaders, next UK general election, Rishi Sunak exit date, and you will see the Rishi Sunak's recent improvement in his profile has been reflected in the odds, and you will get betting on the US presidential election next year as well, with Joe Biden a 2-1 favourite and Paul very much in that camp. We shall be back next week.